Picture this. A vast stone chamber beneath the streets of Paris, torch flames dancing across weathered walls carved with symbols most have never seen. The air thick with centuries of secrecy. And there, etched into the cold granite, a single name that would change everything you thought you knew about power, about bloodlines, about the very foundations of the world we live in today. You're standing at the threshold of one of history's most carefully guarded mysteries. Not the treasure of the Knights Templar, though that's part of it. Not their supposed heretical rituals, though those whispers persist. Something far more dangerous. Something that connects medieval warrior monks to modern boardrooms, ancient bloodlines to contemporary power structures, sacred vows to secular control. The Templars didn't just disappear when King Philip IV crushed their order in 1307. They evolved. They adapted. They survived. And their legacy, their true legacy, flows through veins you'd never suspect, in places you'd never think to look. Tonight, we're going to trace those bloodlines from the cobblestones of medieval Europe to the corridors of modern influence. We'll follow names that echo through centuries, families that shaped kingdoms and toppled empires, genetic threads that weave through the fabric of power itself. This isn't just history. This is genealogy with teeth. So settle back, let the day's tensions melt away, and allow your mind to drift into the shadows where truth and legend blur together like candlelight on ancient stone. Because what you're about to hear will change how you see the world around you. The bloodlines are real. The legacy endures. And it's closer than you think. The year was 1118. Jerusalem had been in Christian hands for less than 2 decades, a fragile foothold in a hostile land. Pilgrims streamed toward the holy city, but the roads were treacherous, haunted by bandits and worse. It was into this chaos that 9 French knights stepped forward with a proposition that would echo through the ages. Their names are lost to most of history now, but their leader was not. Hugh de Payens, a minor nobleman from Champagne, approached King Baldwin II of Jerusalem with an unusual request. They wished to form a military order, dedicated to protecting pilgrims on the dangerous roads to the holy sites. They asked for nothing more than quarters near the Temple Mount, in what had once been Solomon's temple itself. The king agreed. How could he not? 9 knights offering to patrol hundreds of miles of hostile territory seemed like a gift from heaven, but those who looked closer might have wondered. 9 men to guard an entire kingdom's worth of roads. It seemed almost laughably inadequate, unless of course they had something else in mind entirely. For 9 years, these knights lived in the ruins above what they believed to be Solomon's temple. 9 years of supposed poverty, chastity, and obedience. 9 years during which they conducted no recorded rescues, fought no documented battles, saved no known pilgrims. 9 years of digging. Always digging. What were they searching for in those ancient foundations? Some say the Ark of the Covenant. Others whisper of scrolls containing the true teachings of Christ. But there's another possibility, one far more earthly and yet somehow more profound. They may have been searching for proof of lineages, proof of bloodlines, proof of connections that would remake the power structures of medieval Europe. When the Knights Templar finally emerged from their decade of obscurity, they were transformed. No longer 9 impoverished knights begging for shelter, they had become something unprecedented in medieval society. A military order with papal backing, vast wealth, and most importantly, knowledge. Knowledge that kings would kill for and popes would die to suppress. But here's where the story takes its first unexpected turn. The Templars didn't recruit randomly. They didn't simply accept any knight who wished to join their cause. They were selective, methodical, almost as if they were following a list of names, a list of families, a list of bloodlines. Look at their early membership rolls and patterns emerge. Certain surnames appear again and again: de Montfort, de Bouillon, de Saint-Clair. Names that trace back not just to nobility, but to specific regions, specific bloodlines, specific genetic threads that seem to weave through the founding of the order itself. Take Hugh de Payens himself. His family wasn't just from Champagne. They were connected to the Counts of Champagne, who in turn traced their lineage back to Merovingian kings. The same Merovingian dynasty that claimed divine right not through papal blessing, but through blood itself. Blood that some whispered connected directly to the sacred. Or consider Godfrey de Saint-Omer, another founding member. The Saint-Omer family would later intermarry with the Sinclairs of Scotland, a bloodline that would carry Templar secrets across centuries and oceans, eventually establishing roots in the New World itself. Coincidence? Perhaps, but coincidences have a way of multiplying when you start looking closely at Templar genealogy. Then there's André de Montbard, uncle to Bernard of Clairvaux, the Cistercian abbot who would become the Templars' most powerful advocate. Bernard didn't just support the Templars, he wrote their rule, their constitution, their very identity. And his nephew wasn't just a member, he was among the founding 9. Family connections ran deeper than vows of poverty. These weren't random knights seeking adventure in the Holy Land. These were carefully selected representatives of specific bloodlines, brought together for a purpose that went far beyond protecting pilgrims. They were the beginning of something that had never existed before. A transnational organization with military might, financial power, and most dangerously of all, genetic legitimacy. Because here's what the chronicles don't tell you. The Templars weren't just warrior monks, they were archivists, keepers of records, genealogists with swords. And in those 9 years of digging beneath the Temple Mount, they may have found more than ancient treasures. They may have found proof of bloodlines that connected their own families to something far older and more sacred than any crown in Europe. The implications were staggering. If certain families could prove genetic descent from biblical figures, from sacred bloodlines, from the very foundations of faith itself, then the entire structure of medieval power would be called into question. Kings ruled by divine right. But what if that right belonged by blood to others? Popes claimed apostolic succession, but what if true succession ran through different veins entirely? The Templars grew in power with unprecedented speed. Within decades, they controlled vast estates across Europe. They created the first international banking system. They built castles that still stand today. They accumulated wealth that made kings envious and popes nervous. But their true treasure wasn't gold. It was information. Information about bloodlines. Information about legitimacy. Information about who really had the right to rule. And that information, that genetic intelligence, would prove more dangerous than any sword they ever carried into battle. The records are fragmentary now, scattered across centuries and continents like leaves in an autumn wind. But if you know where to look, if you understand the language of heraldry and genealogy, the patterns emerge from the shadows with startling clarity. By the 13th century, the Templars had become more than a military order. They were a genetic repository, a living archive of bloodlines that stretched back through the mists of European history. Their preceptories weren't just military outposts, they were breeding grounds for a new kind of nobility, one based not on conquered land or papal favour, but on something far more permanent. Blood memory. Consider the marriage records of Templar families during their golden age. The unions weren't random romantic entanglements. They were strategic genetic alliances, carefully orchestrated to preserve and strengthen specific bloodlines. A de Montfort daughter would marry a Sinclair son. A Plantagenet cousin would wed into the de Bouillon line. Each marriage a thread in a tapestry being woven across generations. The Templars understood something that wouldn't be formally recognized until the age of Darwin. Bloodlines carry more than just physical traits. They carry memory, instinct, the accumulated wisdom of ancestors encoded in the very structure of DNA itself. And if certain bloodlines carried sacred memory, divine connection, then preserving those lines became not just political strategy, but spiritual imperative. When Friday the 13th arrived in 1307, when Philip's soldiers hammered on Templar doors across France, the order was ready. Not because they had spies in the royal court, though they certainly did. Not because they had hidden their gold, though most of it had already been moved. They were ready because they had spent 2 centuries preparing for exactly this moment. The arrests were thorough but not complete. Certain knights vanished into the morning mist. Certain ships sailed from La Rochelle harbour before dawn, their cargo more precious than gold or silver. They carried bloodlines. They carried genetic treasures that no king's torture could extract, no pope's decree could nullify. Where did they go, these surviving carriers of Templar blood? Some sailed north to Scotland, where Robert the Bruce welcomed them with open arms. Others travelled east into the Germanic states, where sympathetic nobles offered sanctuary. Still others ventured further, across oceans that most Europeans still feared, carrying their genetic legacy to shores that wouldn't see official European contact for another century. But the most successful survivors didn't flee at all. They adapted. They changed their names, altered their heraldry, modified their allegiances. They became merchants instead of warriors, bankers instead of knights, advisors instead of commanders. They learned the most valuable lesson of all. True power doesn't announce itself with trumpets and banners. It whispers in boardrooms and marriage chambers. The de Montfort became the Montagues. The de Saint-Clair transformed into the Sinclairs. The de Bouillon evolved into new identities entirely, their original names surviving only in coded references in family genealogies that most would dismiss as romantic fantasy. But the blood remained. The genetic memory endured. The connections persisted across centuries of apparent dissolution. By the Renaissance, these transformed bloodlines had woven themselves into the very fabric of European power. They weren't kings, but they advised kings. They weren't popes, but they influenced papal decisions. They weren't emperors, but they controlled the flow of gold that made empires possible. They had learned the ultimate secret of power. It's not about ruling from the throne. It's about controlling who sits on it. The Medici banking empire that financed the Renaissance. Templar blood. The exploration fleets that discovered new continents. Templar funding. The printing presses that spread knowledge across Europe. Templar backing. Always behind the scenes, always in the shadows, always protecting and advancing the interests of their genetic inheritance. And as the centuries turned, as the medieval world gave way to the modern, these bloodlines adapted once again. They became industrialists during the age of steam. They became financiers during the rise of capitalism. They became advisors during the birth of democracy. Each transformation preserved their essential nature while adapting to new circumstances. Today, their descendants walk among us still, not as knights in white mantles, but as executives in tailored suits, not wielding swords and shields, but controlling information and capital. The bloodlines that began in those stone chambers beneath Jerusalem now flow through the veins of people whose names you know, whose decisions shape the world you inhabit. They sit on corporate boards and advisory committees. They head foundations and think tanks. They influence policy from positions that never appear on organizational charts, never attract media attention, never leave fingerprints on the decisions that matter most. The ultimate evolution of Templar strategy. Power without visibility, control without accountability, influence without attribution. The genetic legacy that began with 9 knights digging in ancient ruins has become something far more sophisticated and far more pervasive than its medieval founders could have imagined. It has become the invisible architecture of modern power itself. And perhaps that's exactly what they intended all along. Perhaps those 9 years of digging weren't just about finding ancient treasures. Perhaps they were about planting seeds that would grow into something far more valuable than gold or silver, or even sacred relics. seeds of influence that would bloom across centuries, creating a network of genetic inheritance that would outlast kingdoms and empires and ideologies. The Templars didn't disappear in 1307, they simply learned to become invisible, and their bloodlines, those carefully preserved genetic threads that connect medieval mysteries to modern realities, continue to shape the world in ways that most of us will never recognize, never understand, and never question. The legacy endures, the bloodlines persist, and somewhere in the flowing networks of contemporary power, the genetic memory of those 9 knights still whispers its ancient secrets to those who carry the blood to hear them. Sleep well, knowing that history's greatest mysteries often hide in plain sight, flowing through the very blood that courses through the veins of those who shape our world. The Templar bloodlines live on, invisible but eternal, carrying their sacred inheritance into whatever future awaits us all.